Hello, I'm Dr. Bill Stevenson, and I'll be your instructor for this year-long course in the basics of the Catholic faith. As you already know, that the main text that we'll be using for this course is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. We'll be using other books as well, principally the Bible, but other things as well. And so, as I speak to you about the basics of the faith, I'll be making constant reference to the Catechism, so it might be helpful for you to have the readings that you've done for today's lesson in hand as we go through this material. Now, we're going to begin, obviously, with day one, and we'll begin, of course, with the very beginning of the Catechism. Now, the Catechism, you might suppose, would begin with what we call in the business theology proper. That is, would begin with the treatment of who God is, what is the divine nature, and so on. But in fact, it begins in a very surprising place. It begins with you and with me. It begins with the human person. And in particular, it begins with a very important fact about us, and that is that all of us have a natural desire, a natural longing to know and love God. Here's what the Catechism says in paragraph 27. The desire for God is written in the human heart because man is created by God and for God. And God never ceases to draw man to himself. Only in God, now listen, only in God will he find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. Now I say that's a surprising fact because when you look around, it doesn't seem like everybody has a natural desire for God. It doesn't seem like man is always searching for truth and happiness, so it can kind of seem a little bit like the Catechism is making an outlandish claim here. What does it mean to say that that the desire for God is sort of written in to the human heart? Well, here's why the Catechism can say this. And by the way, this is not alone in making that claim. Philosophers and theologians throughout the centuries have made the exact same claim. And it's based on this, that everybody by nature desires happiness. And that happiness, or that desire rather, is different than every other kind of desire that we might have because it never ends. Every other desire that we have is satisfied by finite goods. All right? So that when you think about you've been out mowing the lawn and you're really, really hot and nothing tastes better, nothing sounds better than a nice cold glass of ice water. And you know how that feels. And you have a big glass of ice water or maybe a couple of those, and what happens to the desire? It diminishes and finally goes away. And nobody, when they're not thirsty, just gets a thing of ice water just for the fun of it because ice water is so delicious. So that kind of desire is a finite desire because it is satisfied by something finite, a couple of glasses of water. And every other desire like that is also finite. But our desire for happiness is infinite. And we know this because even when certain things in our life, whether they're material things, whether they're relationships that we have, whether there are jobs that whatever that may be, those things make us happy in a kind of partial way, but there's still this yearning deep down inside of us for a more permanent, a more profound happiness. Let's move on here because I want to say something about the way in which this desire for God has manifested itself down through human history. And what the Catechism tells us is that the desire for God, the thirst for God, has manifested itself through the various religions in human history, in the spiritual practices and so forth that you find everywhere and at every time in human history. Now, why there are so many religions is something that we'll get to later on, but the fact of the matter is that everywhere man has been, there's been religion. Now, there's a sort of modern misapprehension that somehow man is by nature sort of godless or secular, and that religion is a kind of add-on. Man invented religion and invented God later on in his history. But that simply isn't true to the facts. The fact of the matter is that man has always been religious. And so a kind of secularism or atheism is something that's of relatively recent vintage. That's only in the last few hundred years. Now, why is this important, just to say that man has always been religious? Well, I think we can say this, that whenever you have a being that always acts in the same way, regardless of history, regardless of culture, regardless of place, that we can safely say that that is something that is natural to that being. Okay? And so if it's true that everywhere there's been man, there's been religion, we can say that man is by nature religious. That the quest for God is always, and in every place and time, going to show itself, and it'll show itself principally through his religion and his spiritual practices. Okay, so what does the Catechism say? It says, and this is, by the way, paragraph 28, these forms of religious expression, despite the ambiguities they often bring with them, are so universal that one may well call man a religious being. That's the kind of being that man is. Unlike the animals, unlike obviously the plants and so on, man is religious by his very nature. And in fact, we see that in Acts chapter 17. You'll recall that that's the chapter in which the Apostle Paul is preaching to the men of Athens. Athens, this birthplace of philosophy, the place where some of the great classics, the first classics of human history, were written. Paul isn't preaching to the Athenians because they're not religious or that they don't believe in God. Quite the opposite. In fact, they believe in a lot of gods. He remarks, you'll recall, on all the altars that they have devoted to the different divinities. And so he's not bringing to religion to people who are religionless. He's bringing the true religion to people who seem to be, by one sort of estimation, seem to be very confused about who God is or who the gods are. And that's what Paul does. That's sort of his hook. He says, men of Athens, I know you're very religious, but I've noticed that amongst all the different altars that I came upon one that was devoted to the unknown God. And my job here, so to speak, is to make known to you that God that you worship in ignorance. And that's sort of his way of beginning to tell the gospel of Jesus Christ. That amongst all the false gods they worship, there's some way in which they worship a God who, as it turns out, is the true God, but whom they do not know. And so Paul's job is to reveal that to the men of Athens. Okay? So for the most part, where the gospel has gone, where biblical religion has been preached, it's not been preached to people who just simply don't believe in gods or God, but rather those who are religious, but who worship God either falsely or worship false gods. And that's what Paul is doing in Acts chapter 17. All right? So again, that man's quest for God has manifested itself in different religions. Now, it might be easy to suppose, when we talk about the search for God, the quest for God, it might be easy to suppose that somehow you can just sort of go on automatic pilot. Because, hey, look, it's natural to us to search for our own happiness. But the fact of the matter is that for a lot of us, maybe most of us, we don't work terribly hard to find truth, to find the fullness of happiness. We can get pretty lazy about this. And the Catechism remarks on this fact about ourselves and gives us some guidance in this connection. It says in paragraph 30, "Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice, that although man can forget God or reject Him, He never ceases to call every man to seek Him so as to find life and happiness. But," and catch this search for God demands of man every effort of intellect, a sound will, an upright heart, as well as the witness of others who teach him to seek God. Okay, so that the search for God requires everything about us. Requires an upright heart, requires an intellectual kind of vitality and seriousness, as well as somebody to witness to us about the truth that God wishes for us to know. Now, we will be getting to divine revelation, but in our next lesson, we will be speaking about the ways in which man, by the use of his reason alone, unaided reason, can come to a knowledge of a God and of a personal God in particular. So that'll be tomorrow's lesson. Thank you.